Well, as I said last week's message and this week's message are our most Lent-like messages in this particular season. And so this week, I'll unpack what that means in a little bit, but we come to the end of a very big section in Romans. And where we come is, it's more or less the end of the sort of debate that's been happening between Paul and this rival missionary teacher who's off screen, who has a different idea of the faith and the good news. And so this week, this comes to a close, the conversation between them. We said last week that Paul, he was in the final stages of dismantling the teacher's sense of superiority over those people over there, those Gentiles. And Paul will begin by breaking down the dividing wall, sort of putting the last nail in the coffin to that idea that exists for the teacher between the Jewish followers of God and everybody else in the world. And so Paul begins our reading. If you're following along, this is chapter 3, verse 9. Paul begins the reading by saying in the teacher's voice, what then? Are we any better off? Meaning, are we, the Jewish followers of God, any better off? And Paul says, no, not at all, for we've already charged that all, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin. Now, what Paul is saying is that all of us are in the same boat. And as we said last week, there's not one group who's better or worse than the other. We're all in the same boat, and we're probably all worse off than we thought. And Paul is going to outline that immediately in what follows. And so this is beginning in verse 10. As it is written, there is no one who is righteous, not even one. There's no one who has understanding. There's no one who seeks God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. There is no one who shows kindness. There is not even one. Their throats are open graves. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery are in their paths, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Friends, may God add blessing and understanding to these words this morning. Now, this one is particularly tricky for a pastor. Like I said, Romans is a particularly tricky book to preach all around. But this week, there's a very fine line that we're walking because Paul has laid out some pretty heavy charges. There's no one who shows kindness. Their throats are open grave. Ruin and misery are in their paths, just to name a few. Now, on the one hand, it would be unfaithful to Paul's point to simply sweep it under the rug and say, this must be for somebody else, though truthfully, wouldn't we like to do that? On the other hand, I don't want to beat us over the head with hellfire and damnation, and these words are hard for us to hear. Too often in uncareful preaching, this text can be used as a bludgeoning tool against those people over there, or in uncareful preaching, we just skip it because we don't want to deal with the message. The words are tough, but I hope that if we navigate them faithfully, we can find some meaning in them together. So I said at the beginning, this is a Lent-like message. Paul is writing, this is what I mean. In Paul's writing and in this message and in last week's sermon, what we're trying to do is highlight our humanity. We're saying that Paul is going to be honest about our brokenness and invite us into a somber assessment of who we are ourselves and who the world is, what the world is. That these passages and these messages, finally, that they'll call us to repentance. But all of this is done in service of something, as Lent is, to prepare us for the good news of Easter. And what Paul is doing is preparing the Roman audience to hear and to receive a more full account of the gospel of the good news. He's got to prime the pump like that. And so we said, Paul's trying to make sure that we know we're all in the same boat. Did you catch that in the text? No one, not even one, no one, not even one. Paul wants us to see everybody is in the midst of this. So we talked last week about our desire to point to people over there, or to point at people who point at people over there, to be self-righteous about the self-righteous ones. Or maybe we hear this text and we want to point to our old self. Maybe old me needed to hear this message, but now I've moved past that. Paul will continue to challenge us to take the fingers that we point at other people and to point them back at ourselves, to take a look in the mirror. And I want us to do that today, both in this message as a whole, but I'm going to bring us to do that in a few places throughout it. So I want to be clear about one thing as we begin that will help us more faithfully navigate this reading. I want us to understand this through a lens of reciprocity. And here's what I mean. We'll unpack this in future chapters, but for Paul, there is very much this two-level thinking that's going on. So Paul, right here, he's talking to you and I. there's maybe some finger pointing at you and I, the way that we live our lives, the words that we say, the way that we think, the actions that we take or inspire or enable. Paul is talking about all of that, but Paul is also talking about bigger themes. Systems and structures, powers and principalities, all of those things that are at play. For Paul, sin is not primarily or fundamentally about missing the mark, about what you and I do. That's a piece of it. But for Paul, sin is primarily about a cosmic force that is actually outside of us, that is working within us. We might liken it to something like cancer. There is something within us that we need to get rid of, or for Paul, more precisely, that we need to have somebody eradicate within us if we are to most fully be alive. And so that's kind of what there's this reciprocity between the individual and the big. And we contribute to the big, and we are affected by the big. And so there's this back and forth. It's the chicken and the egg. And all throughout this text, Paul is speaking to both of those. And again, we'll unpack this throughout the rest of Romans, but I want us to keep that in mind, that we're not totally absolved from responsibility. And at the same time, this isn't primarily about some primal failure on our own part. So let's talk about what Paul is saying. And there's really three sections that he goes through here in a pretty orderly fashion and in an intentional fashion. And I want to talk about those. By the way, Paul is pulling all of this that we read, that main section, is all references to the Old Testament from Psalms and Isaiah and Ecclesiastes. If you want to dive into those, I would love to talk about those. And there's a bigger story. We will revisit some of that in weeks to come. But I do want to invite you on Thursday afternoon, 4 o'clock, chat with the virtual coffee talk on Zoom. I'd love to unpack some of that if you're interested. So anyway, that offer is out there. The first section is basically about our misunderstanding of God. There is no one righteous, not even one, no one who has understanding. There is no one who seeks God. Basically what that's saying is nobody has a proper conception of or a proper relationship to God. And that for Paul is the foundation of things. So of course, we can't fully know God because we are not God. And if we could fully know God, God wouldn't be God. But he's saying we have these misconstrued relationships as well about God. So not only do we not know God, but we don't have proper relationship with God. And that is the foundation for all of the rest of the things that don't work. So let me give you some ideas of that. When we aren't in proper relationship with God, what we do is we look for our worth and our value and our meaning in other relationships, in other things, in acquiring certain status or certain wealth. We turn to those things to give us a sense of value that we're intended to find in God. When we don't have a proper conception of who God is, when we think God's love is narrow or limited, we sometimes draw circles around who's included and who matters and who has worth and value and who gets to be a part of God's goodness and blessing. Those are foundations from which a lot of other things get messed up further down the line. So Paul will continue in his second section, this is verse 13 and 14, by saying their throats are opened graves. By the way, great punk rock band name if you want. They use their tongues to deceive. The venom of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Now, this is not just talking about cursing, like using swear words and things like that, though I would imagine that is included in this. Notice that idea of referencing snakes. The vipers, the venom of vipers. Where have we seen a snake? All the way back in Genesis 3. Where does the estrangement from God begin? In Genesis 3 with a lie, with a deception from the serpent, the Satan, the one who would destroy, with this conversation with Eve. The language that's being talked about here is not only poor language or whatever. It's that which harms, that which tells lies about God, that's which perpetuates lies about God, that which hurts others. This idea that the throats are open graves is sort of meant to say that this is leading to death, that the words that we use, the ideas that we have, the conversations that we have, the way that we perceive others, it has actual real consequences. This is something that we're going to keep coming back to throughout our message today, is that the words that we say, our perception of God and the words that we say and how we express or interact with the world has real, actual consequences. And Paul's going to explain those consequences in the third section like this. Their feet are swift to shed blood, ruin and misery are in their paths, and the way of peace they do not know. He's talking about violence. Now, we shouldn't just limit ourselves to violence as sort of enacting physical harm on another person. We're going to talk about how we shouldn't absolve ourselves of that immediately either. But we can talk about the ways that our actions prevent other people from being able to thrive or even survive. We can talk about the way that our actions dismiss from somebody some sense of fundamental worth or humanity. Going back to our understanding of God, if we don't believe that every person is a child of God and an image bearer of God, and we don't treat people like that, what we do is we treat them as less than human, and that has actual consequences. We see that in the global economy. We see that in our own community. We see that in the way that people are demeaned or dismissed or pushed to the edges. It happens in all kinds of ways, and we'll continue to sort of unpack that as we go. But this progression of wrong thoughts about God and language and then violence, it can't possibly be read from Paul in Paul's day without thinking that he's looking at the Roman emperor cult as he's writing. They clearly and vividly display all of these characteristics in a way that I think is easy for us to wrap our mind around. For them, emperor was God. Caesar is Lord. Step one, misunderstanding of God, right there, clear, plain and simple. Step two, they used their tongues to deceive. The empire's cult became masters of the propaganda machine. They swore that they were bringing peace to the world. They insisted on the divinity of Caesar. They talked about the prosperity that was mounting for all of the Roman citizens, and they flooded the streets with these messages until people didn't question what sort of peace came while you also had to step over the bodies that were piling up. They stopped asking what kind of peace was dependent upon all of the thousands and thousands of people every year who were publicly crucified on crosses. They kept sending this message until people stopped wondering how this prosperity that was meant for all was really built on the back of slave labor. They quit questioning those sorts of things. The propaganda machine was alive and well, declaring that they were bringing about the fulfillment and the salvation of all of the world. And if they said it enough times, then the collateral damage could begin to be looked past. They whitewashed this reality of violence that supported the system, and they continually reiterated this misunderstanding of God. And then we come to this last part, right? Step three, ruin and misery lie in their paths, the way of peace they do not know. We've talked about how that whole system is built on violence. There is this three-step progression that we can't help but see the Roman Empire in, and think that Paul is pointing to that. And so I want to ask you a question. Who's responsible for that? Is it the emperor who was born into a system where he was told from birth that he was the Son of God? Is it the propagandists who are writing all of this? Is it the soldiers who are saying, I'm just doing what I'm told? Or perhaps rationalizing it by saying some violence is required for peace for the rest. Whose responsibility is it? That question gets us to that idea of reciprocity. It's both and. It falls, there's individual responsibility for all the cogs in the machine, and there is a larger system at play. And as we have this misconceived idea of God, this difference between who God is and in our mind and who God is in reality, we have this separation between creator and created. And part of what sin and powers and principalities do is they want to thrive. They want to keep the power, so they keep working for that system. For instance, it's like a virus. It will mutate in order to maintain its power to continue to propagate. And without some sort of outside intervention, things don't get righted. So that's what we're talking about, this reciprocity. And Paul is saying we want to point to other people. We want to point to the Roman Empire and say, well, they did that, but we don't do it. Paul's saying we're all in the same boat. You can fast forward to Constantine. When he moves the entire empire into Christianity, what does he say? We're going to wipe out all the non-believers. That's the opening declaration, and that's what he did with a lot of them. You could go on to the Crusades that used debased language and wrong thoughts about God in order to perpetrate violence across the world. You could go on to the First and Second World Wars and look at the ways that those come to be. And you could find this same pattern, but there's no need to look back even to the last century. I say this with a bit of trepidation because I know that it's a fresh wound and it may not all feel clear-cut to everybody, but I think back to January 6th. And I think what happened that day, and what I hope is that what that does for us is we want to point to other people and other times in history, is that it reminds us that our language, the things that we say, the truths that we believe, the lengths to which we are willing to go to promote our own ways of understanding or being or power, that it has tangible, visible consequences. That's, in my assessment, one of the things that happened on January 6th. There were tangible, visible consequences to actions, to words that were spoken, that language took form, and it cost lives, and it made a lot of us question a lot of things. And we need to ask those questions, and perhaps it forced us to ask those questions. But we don't even have to go back to January. What about this week? You likely read, as I did this week, about violence in Georgia. How many are dead now? One of the things that arose in the reporting around those shootings is that it was drawn once again to our attention about the increased violence against Asians in our country that's happened over the last year, particularly over the last year as the pandemic has come to change our way of being. Friends, we can't keep looking away from our brothers and sisters of Asian descent who keep telling us that this is on the rise and pretend that it's not happening. We can't say that the threats and the demeaning experiences that they have are no longer valid if we believe that they are also children of God and bear the image of God. Or did those victims not die because they were Asian? Did they die because they were women? Because women are far too often seen as expendable in our society. Because Asian women specifically are perceived as less than. Does the existence of the very places where they died point to the value or the lack thereof that we assign to an entire gender in our society? We have to recognize that the high level, on the high level, that oftentimes what we believe and the words that we say, they manifest ourselves in ways down the line that we may not ever see. Small acts of diminishing other people. We may not enact violence on somebody else, but how do the systems at play continue to build on one another? What are the ripple effects from that? What do our words and our ideas and our perceptions ripple out into the world, even into things that we would say we would never ourselves do? Paul says in the scriptures there is a connection between our thoughts and our words and the actions of the world. What is that for us? We say, I'd never shoot anybody. I wasn't at the Capitol. Wasn't a part of an empire or a crusade or world war. That's true. But Paul is saying how big we draw the circle of God's love, that matters. The ways that we speak matter. The ways that we hold one another accountable, or the conversations that we have, or the people that we don't have conversations with. All of that has an impact on everyday life for other people, and it may even manifest itself as violence. Perhaps that violence comes in limiting somebody else's ability to be themselves or to speak for themselves. Perhaps our beliefs about the value and the redemptibility of certain people has led to our vastly expanding prison population. Perhaps our beliefs about the abundance or the scarcity of God and God's nature affect the kind of economy that we work towards. If we take nothing else from this message, friends, I hope that we understand that there's a connection between A and B and C and how the world looks because of those things. And I can't tell you exactly perhaps what places your A or your B, your language or your thoughts about God need to be sort of re-examined, but I can say that each and every one of us has those things that we need to think about, and the connections between them are worth thinking about because it affects the way the world works. So I want to give just a few more examples. I, Kyle, your pastor, have said things to customer service representatives, to front desk workers, to fast food employees. You could go on down the list. Perhaps we could generally categorize it as hourly workers. But I have said things to people like that I would never say to one of you. I would never say to one of my family members. I wouldn't say to a colleague or a neighbor. I wouldn't say to a classmate. And I'm not talking about like a cursing tantrum, throw a fit, make a big scene. Sometimes it's just a matter of indifference, of looking past, not engaging at all. Sometimes it's been complaints or frustrations. But I've said things and done things that were unkind or unguarded or just unpolished, not my best self, that I would never do in another setting. Why? What does that say? What does that say about what I think about those people? When I just say, well, their opinion of me doesn't matter. Even if it's just about me, their opinion, their perception of me. I care about how my colleagues and my parishioners think about me, but for them, it's not a big deal. My guess is maybe you've done the same thing. What does that say about the value that we place in another person? Here's another example. I live in a county, one of the wealthiest counties in the United States of America, the wealthiest nation in the world. And we have elected officials and organizations and individuals that are committed to and are very transparent about their desire to keep poor people out of Johnson County. They exist for that purpose. They don't even feel the need to hide it. There are organized efforts to keep people below a certain level of means, well, I guess away from the rest of us. What does that say about us, you? I mean, not you and I individually, but collectively, in that reciprocity, in the life that we live. What does that say about who we are? What does it say about what we think of God? About the power of our words and thoughts and action and inaction, about our values? What does it say about the worth and the life and the well-being of those with less resources than us? We could go on. There's all kinds of examples. But I want to end with one example that I certainly was thinking about because of the Vatican this week and their announcement about LGBTQIA folks and who was considered valid in their eyes. And I'm going to assume that the authors aren't hate-filled or terrible people. I'm going to assume actually that they're doing the best that they can as far as they understand God. And by the way, I'm not just going to cast stones there. I'm also going to say that I am ordained in a denomination that takes pretty much the same stance about LGBTQIA people and their inclusion and how they can be included in the life of the church and what that looks like. And oftentimes we talk about, we say, well, we think all people are of sacred worth, but then the actions, the statements do violence in how people live. And when we have certain understandings about how wide, how inclusive, how open God's love is, it leads us to say certain things, make declarations that then leads to actions. Not direct violence. But let me tell you something that was the same this week as a particular week in February 2019, while I was gathered with United Methodists from around the world for a conference where we talked about inclusion of the LGBTQIA community. I have a good friend who works for the Trevor Project, which is a support network and suicide prevention line for LGBTQIA youth. In 2019, as I was on my way home, he called me and he said, "What are you guys doing?" And I started to explain it, and he said, No, I know what happened. And I know that because this week we got a giant uptick in calls because a bunch of young people who identify as LGBTQIA heard that their church didn't think that they could be a part of the life of the community. This week it was reported the same thing happened after the announcement from the Vatican. And friends, it's not a direct act of violence, but we have to acknowledge the fact that the LGBTQIA youth continue to be bullied and pushed out of community and limited in what they're allowed to participate in or what they're included in, that incidents of violence against them continue to be much higher than the general population, and that incidences of self-harm continue to happen. All of this is connected to the language, to the beliefs we have about God, to the language that we share with others, and we have to understand, it doesn't mean that we can't have conversations and hard conversations about different things. It doesn't mean that one side is mean-spirited. It means we have to understand the connection between what we think and say and live and legislate and how actual people's lives are affected. So maybe for you, LGBTQIA inclusion isn't difficult. Maybe for you, inclusion of Asian Americans isn't difficult, or hourly workers, or poor people. But all of us have places and ways that we struggle, not only in our understanding of God, but our understanding of what it means to be a part of building God's kingdom around us. What Paul is challenging us to in this is to be real about that, to recognize that it's not all our fault, but we do play a role. And we can't fix it all, but we can make a difference. Paul is priming the pump for us to be able to receive the good news of grace and Easter, to recognize that something beyond us has come and it will change everything. So friends, in this week ahead, I just want to challenge you to wrestle with that, to see what it looks like in your life, and to see if we might together find what it means to experience freedom and grace and to share that with others. That is our challenge in this very tough text this week. And I want to encourage you to wrestle with it in the days ahead. Let's take a few moments for reflection.